we were one of the first 20 tier cities in the country to do, and this was a metro-wide. We had 5 jurisdictions involved. That plan was submitted and approved by HUD. We are now proceeding with implementing that. It will be a part of our performance report in July to HUD. I will add that HUD is going through a reevaluation of the fair housing planning requirements.
Who knew?
Yeah. And so we understand that there's a new notice coming out from HUD that will give other jurisdictions across the country some guidance on how or whether to proceed with fair housing. We are staying the course. We're going to implement this plan over the next 5 years, 4 years. Like I said, we've come through the first year, and there's a range of goals. We had 39 goals. There's a lot of work to do. Our 5-year plan is a plan for all Kansas City. It's not just for the core priority areas, and we have 4 priority area plans and 14 what we call opportunity areas. And Jennifer, maybe you can talk about some of the activities that we're doing.
So some of the big activities that we're trying to do that was identified in the AFH was the completion of the Choice Neighborhood grant, and trying to make sure that those housing units are back online. The other thing is trying to determine how we can do mixed financing and mixed income across the city. And you'll see rental housing rehab as well as one of our big AFH goals. Homeless prevention, we're working quite a bit with the Greater Kansas City Homeless Coalition, and trying to coordinate with them in terms of their Housing First goals. Truman Medical Center has a new initiative that they're going to be creating 500 more units, and we'll be working closely with them to do those in a number of different areas across the city. So we'll definitely be working on that. In terms of youth services, there's a big push by HUD to create more housing units for youth 18 to 24, especially because of the fact that that is a growing homeless population. So that's one of the things that we'll be working on as well. Section 3 program, we're working with the Human Relations Department to do some maybe training around Section 3 with a number of different stakeholders like contractors and financing folks in order to help them do some training as it relates to economic development.
I'm a little confused by the chart where it says like youth services, support education initiatives down near the bottom, goal numbers 29 and 29, and then across on the plan 28, 2,850 and 900. I'm not sure what that means. Are those units of some sort, housing units, and or what's that 28?
This is a 5-year goal, so
Yeah.
it's a cumulative over those 5 years.
Sure.
We have a lot of those activities in our annual action plan. Persons served, children served, homeless persons served, and like I said, this is cumulative.
So these are persons?
These are persons to be served?
Right. In child care, you'll see persons.
Okay. Okay.
Services.
Tell me how that happens. I'm confused by what is actually going to happen. There are 29 youth services, support education initiatives, 2,850 people served. What does that mean?
Well, Guadalupe centers, they assist about 2,000 students a year.
With housing?
No, with counseling service and child care, those kinds of things.
Okay,
this
so
is not providing a roof over their heads. No, you're right.
Okay.
On the new housing, we acknowledge that we can't do this alone with our own financing. And in the plan, we talk a lot about collaborating with local financial institutions. and actually communicating with them like we did back in the 90s, where we actually talked, and we found out what they were doing, where they were doing it.
Text them.
And
Get a better response.
yeah.
Social media, tweet them.
And, you know, there's a lot of loans being made that, like I said, Lead Bank especially getting very active, things like that, and we just want to capture what they're doing. And it's a lot of the market is making decisions based on activities that we're doing in certain areas of the city. So, like I said, it's not exactly like we did in the past where we made second mortgages on a lot of homes. But we, because of the dwindling resources that we have, but we do want to encourage and collaborate with financial institutions in how they're making loans.
Okay,
Also, MHDC has a very active loan program, and we want to start steering some of those loans into our priority areas.
Okay. I'm just confused by the phrase support education initiatives in this context and trying to figure out where's the crossroads between what you're talking about and supporting education initiatives?
Well, the school district was very involved in this.
Okay.
Shannon Jacks was actively involved in the plan. You know, we've talked in our housing policy about identifying schools as areas of strength and building around them.
Okay, gotcha.
Those kinds of collaborative efforts.
Okay, got it.
And,
Thanks.
and I would just add that that in the AFFH process, there was a big push to try to do a holistic housing approach, not just housing, but services around that housing, and thus choice neighborhoods and some of the other things that came out of it in terms of educational initiatives. And so Mark and some of the other stakeholders that participated in AFFH actually wanted to support educational initiatives around those housing units.
Okay, makes sense. I was just confused. Now I've got an explanation that's less confusing. Okay. Are we done with this?
So the next couple slides deal with other aspects of the AFH, I believe, and the interaction with the comp plan. I don't know if you have any other comments about those, but.
Okay.
Well, we're just rolling out our 2018 plan, and like I said, it stays the course on a lot of minor home repair. We have over 500 applications coming in again this year. That program is important because it does a major item like a roof or a furnace, critical plumbing, electrical needs that keep people in their homes. And like I said, the phones ring off the hook beginning May 1, and we can do up about 500 with our CDC partners, Northland Neighborhoods, NHS, and West Side right now.
So here's a discussion for your task force, maybe, I don't know, I might be way off base. But it occurs to me that, you know, on the one hand, we're constantly being on the one hand, there's a constant push to improve housing and property in areas that have been underdeveloped. On the other hand, as soon as you make that improvement, then the yell is that it's gentrified and people who live there have to leave. So it's kind of a, you know, I'm not sure exactly how you improve property and avoid gentrification. But it seems that always needs to be a topic of discussion as you're talking about your housing policy and going forward, particularly in areas on the east side, for example. What's the strategy to avoid the yell of gentrification, et cetera? There is some place that's doing something, and I'm not sure. I think it's in California. Is it San Diego or L.A. or probably not L.A. They're too hedonistic. But San Diego, I think, may be doing something, and I'm not sure what it is. Is it a property tax abatement?
Yeah,
override swath or something like that?
Yeah, and we've got that tool, and we've been kind of looking at as a mechanism to try to figure out a way, whether using LCRA or some sort of a mechanism to kind of freeze some of those increased values. You look at what has happened in Beacon Hill, which is a classic example of we're getting beat up saying, well, we're gentrifying it. But that strategy, we displaced absolutely no one. So what you've got now, and it begs that conversation, is you've got, especially in those east neighborhoods, I would put anything basically west of Prospect, where you're seeing a great deal of wealth generation.
West of Prospect?
I would put it west of Prospect.
Okay.
I think you're starting to see increased property values. The biggest complaint coming out of Northeast with the choice neighborhoods is these increased home values. So, but we're doing it without displacing people, but they are suffering thing while they're saying they're paying higher property taxes on their higher property values. So the mechanism we've got to do is, as we go through there, is I think change the nature of the conversation to from a gentrification to a wealth.
Excuse me. Oh, okay. You're saying there's a couple other people that don't have on ties.
All mine froze today, Mayor. They're flash frozen.
You know, if you got to come correct, brother.
I'm always correct.
Yeah, okay. All right. Never know with you. Mm-hmm. You didn't need that name. Nobody cares.
Happy Tuesday.
You know, I was really looking forward to coming to this meeting, and now I can't remember why.
All right, so I'm sorry.
So, you know, the issue that we've got to figure out as a way to do this, as we get reinvestment back into the neighborhood, that we reframe the conversation as not a gentrification issue, because it's really a wealth creation. Homes that were worth, what, in Beacon Hill, $25,000 are now worth $250,000, $300,000. So we've got to come on a strategy to figure out some sort of a property tax freeze or some sort of.
But if you freeze the property tax, then we'll get it from the school district.
Right. So you're
okay.
No good deed goes unpunished around here, and that's
there's got to be some method because the school districts are, you know, particularly KCPS is already struggling for money, and with this particular government in Jefferson City,
right,
they may struggle more, depending on whether or not there's pictures. But oh, I'm sorry, I didn't say that.
You're going after everybody.
Hey, it's cold, man.
Well, you know, and I'm sensing a trend because he doesn't wear ties either, Mr. Mayor. So
yeah, well, therein lies the problem.
Is that it?
But the bottom line is that there's got to be some way of developing a strategy that at least does as little harm to everybody as possible. But a deep freeze on property taxes, I think, would probably be something school districts would raise Cain about, and then we're fighting that economic development battle again.
I might, if I may,
Sure.
on a serious note, you know, part of the discussion could also be related to, part of the problem is when you have a gentrifier coming in, they make some investment on their housing. For those who have been there for a long, long time, they don't necessarily have that opportunity either because they're financially unable or whatever. But if you could hook a minor home repair piece with a more traditional incentive like a 353 or some of the incentives that LCRA has, which I know you're more familiar with, Mayor, that you might be able to make an investment in a home that someone has been living in for 20 or 30 years and then have the tool that already exists to at least abate that value, but you're not creating anything new in the course of doing that.
We're not abating a geographic area. We're specific properties who've taken specific steps.
Right. We
have a good Apple capability that Stuart can talk about that, which allows you almost a single point of property allows for that tax abatement.
So then the hit on overall property taxes would be relatively minimal from a school district standpoint.
Right, because you're just doing a series of one-offs, and the only real question is how do you create enough investment capital, if you will, that allows you to do enough of it to make a difference in whatever area you may be wanting to target.
Okay.
It's been done before.
Right.
Yeah, it has been done before. And SCARA did it a few years ago. and where they actually, I think you make the investment in your individual home, and the taxes were frozen. I think it was 5 or 10 years.
10, I think it was.
10 years,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Using the LCRA's tool to make that happen.
But I think they also, back in the day, there was also an effort to do it through 353, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's been quite a while, but I think that was another tool that was used a long time ago as well. So you got a couple options there.
Right.
Jeff, did you want to add something?
Well, just the concept in terms of looking at new housing development, really, especially with the concern about gentrification, really looking at creating housing at all points of affordability as that creation happens. I mean, that's one of the best ways to kind of blunt the gentrification concern. As you'd mentioned, just with our unique geography, that we have such lower density levels that sometimes work against us, but in this case work for us because it minimizes any degree of displacement as neighborhoods grow in value. The trick is to have neighborhoods grow in value to a point where new housing happens without there needing to be any filling of a gap. And then at that point, being careful, having circuit breakers such as looking at a mix of different housing options from an affordability perspective, looking at accessory units, other types of things so that people can begin a home ownership journey but still be creating some affordable housing potentially through rental housing. So it's all those different types of strategies. One of the challenges is really making sure as we have the gentrification conversation, we're really keeping in mind all of our unique factors. So that kind of one label of gentrification applied, I think, as people really look at gentrification in urban areas and higher density areas. We just have some different density levels and some abilities to be able to grow value without overheating a market or an area.
Okay, cool. All right. Okay, what are we doing now? Oh,
You want to talk through some of the highlights, current projects?
Oh, you're on to highlights. Good. I like highlights. Yes. We have several. A year ago, we had at Mayor $100 million worth of low-income housing tax credits. We sent you a letter in, and we got not only our 9% credits, but a number of 4% credits. These are now starting to close and get under construction.
Good.
On the board there, the Quinlan Place and Pendleton Arts Block are two choice projects that we've been able to close. Blenheim School is been about 3 rounds of tax credit applications, and we finally incented that with about $800,000 worth of funds to allow that to get over the hump and close. That closed last week. Woodbridge Apartments is a project on the west side that we're looking to close this month. So, like I said, there's 262 units here. In addition, the Colonnades is underway. That got started in early December, and it'll be open in June of this year. So it will be.
Seriously? Okay.
This summer, let's say this summer.
Give me
This summer is
Give me some
2018.
numbers, because you say this summer, this film could be aired next year. So you're talking about the summer of 2018?
2018.
I'm going to hold you to it.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
So those are some of the highlights, and like I said, we continue to have a very active minor home repair program. Like I said, those are addressing things right now with some frozen pipes and some furnace issues, but like I said, we're meeting those needs.
Okay, cool. It's a colonnade. How many units are in one of those buildings?
30.
Total of 30.
6 each.
6 each?
Right. Mhm.
On 3 floors?
Yes.
Okay. Next, elimination of state tax credits.
I would just say this is one of the issues that, again, setting the stage for our housing policy is the state of where we are now with state tax credits. We've been very successful in the past, the past 7.5 years of getting our share of low-income housing tax credit projects passed. However, with the current status of state direction, state policy of eliminating the state tax credits. We're now left with just the federal tax credits, and based on that, we see, and according to staff, a $7 to $10 million gap that needs to be filled. But that's what we're going to be missing out on.
And the new tax laws on the federal level don't affect the tax credits?
Well, I'll tell you what. My conversation with HUD has been that with the new tax law, who needs tax credits? Was the attitude.
I'm sorry. Say what?
The attitude was with the new tax law and the lessening of tax liabilities, who needs tax credits?
No problem at all. It's going to be that good? Oh, for you, for the ones, for public servants, you know, we still need tax credits for the supervisory types.
That's what I was told.
Maybe we can
That's
get
what
along.
I was told from HUD.
Yeah, that they seem to be right on target. They've got their pulse right on their film right on the pulse of the nation there. Yeah.
And what it does is reduce the pricing,
Right.
so that the prices go down, and the gap then increases, because you can't get enough investors to invest the kind of money you need to do these developments. So that's the challenge, is again, filling that gap in these projects.
I wish I could tell you that I had some hope that we would be able to save this, but realistically, in an election year in Jefferson City, when they're talking about reducing or ultimately eliminating the income tax, et cetera, I don't see them being in any kind of a mood to do anything that makes sense, to be quite honest, not on this issue.
I think where they
Well,
moved,
I think we've got to mount an argument and be there.
right.
So here's something. Have you talked to your counterparts in other cities, St. Louis, Springfield, wherever?
We have, as part of the outreach that we were doing about a month or so ago, we were talking to St. Louis, and actually we used our Mr. Gamble and his staff to make some connections. Jeff Smith out of Springfield. So we've been actually having these conversations, and we're trying to come up with a game plan, as well as reaching out to our local legislators. Although the governor did send out a fairly stark statement, and I forgot exactly what he said, but it was pretty clear.
The one on when he eliminated the tax credits?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Well, my guess is we won't be hearing any stark statements from him for a bit. So while he's dealing with other issues, now's the time for us to do some things as soon as they get into session. So this can't be a Kansas City push. This has got to be a statewide push. And so, you know, we've got mayors that are rounded up, and we'll be in Jeff City on the 14th, but we need you guys on the housing side across the state to get together, okay? I mean, if we're serious about this, we're going to have an organized approach. Okay. And what you do you have all the technical knowledge, you can show where the pinch points are, why it's important, et cetera, and then we can combine forces and try and save these tax credits, because this is going to hurt everybody across the country. And the other thing, too, is that, have we done any analysis? When I was meeting with Missouri Mayors for Progress, one of the points that one of the mayors made is that as a result of this, rents are going to go up for some of the people who are in low-income housing units or who want to be, and that their rents will be increased to levels where that will be extremely detrimental. Are you have any information, numbers, thoughts on that issue?
We haven't heard that. The rents are restricted in the affordable units, and there's a period of time where they need to stay restricted. MHDC has been, in this state, been holding those rents fairly tight. I mean, one of the complaints we get from developers, owners, is that with water rate increases and other things that they're not able to make that rent increase to cover those costs. So, but when those units expire, that's when you'll see the big leap in rents.
And units expire on a timetable specific to that particular cluster of units because of when they start. How long is the moratorium on rent increases? How many years?
15.
15.
Sometimes
15.
it's 30.
Okay.
If they have if they're in a
Extended use.
qualified area. But most of the ones that we're seeing is like 15 years.
So have we should have enough history to know that a set of units built in 1970 using low-income housing tax credits, they've rolled off that 30-year whatever, right? Do we know what happened to the rents thereafter? I know it was a totally different economic time, but do we have any data that indicates that when the moratorium is over, the rents increase, and if so, do those housing units then revert more to affordable as opposed to low income because of the rent increase, or what happens there?
Where we have built some of the first low-income housing tax credit, like Justin Place over on Benton.
Yeah.
They're in a different market, of course, than downtown. When those expire, the market is still the low-income market.
Okay.
So
Quality Hill is a good example of one that was, Quality Hill was done with low-income housing tax credits, a lot of federal support. As those rolled off, those went to market.
They went to market.
So it depends on the location.
Right.
So then, at least in that instance,
Right.
we lost a lot of low-income housing units when Quality Hill rolled into a different category.
And where you see a lot of 4% credits going is to the resyndication of older projects. I mean, they need new roofs.
Right.
Parade Park is right there, prime example of a big project that is now aging, needs a lot of improvements, and how to finance those improvements is the big question.
There was a national study done on low-income housing tax credits as they were rolling off, the tax credit period. And primarily it indicated that a lot of those affordable housing, LIHTC units, stay affordable, except for in downtown areas. So there needs to be a push to how do you preserve those affordability units downtown. And we've been working both through the housing policy piece and also with MHDC to just identify those units that are affordable in the Heart of America strategy area, to see if there are some financing tools that we could at least keep a portion of those affordable as they roll off the LIHTC regulatory agreements. So
When all of this broke, there was some conversation about some sort of a substitute loan program. What's that about?
I suspect, and maybe you can touch on it more than I can, but rather than having a tax credit, it really the whole point was to have for the developers to find their own financing and bring the banks their own money to the table, having more skin in the game as opposed to using tax credits.
In other words, no.
Which is going to drive your rent conversation because
That
your rents are
drives
going to
it
go
up.
up.
Right,
So
right.
They
it's,
get to pay the debt level.
Right.
Right. And right now what we're also seeing in a lot of our neighborhoods, both apartments as well as single-family homes that are used for rental purposes for low-income people, although not tied to the low-income housing tax credit program, those units are already charging high rents for very little in return in terms of quality, good housing. We see evidence of that all the time. So people are paying $800, $1,000, $1,200 for single-family homes that are in poor condition. And there's no recourse when the property, if there's water breakage like we had last week in a house. That was in the news, and so we see evidence of that all the time. So that's the other part of this, is that if there are less low-income housing tax credit project units on the marketplace, then the private market, then what their recourse is to buy these single-family homes and rent those out to low-income people, but again, not putting any money of their own into these properties. The people who are living in the residents, they're sort of at the mercy of the landlords, and then the issue of eviction comes into play.
Right.
Since we were talking about preservation of low-income housing tax credit properties in the downtown area, we skipped ahead to slide 21, just since we had a little bit of data on that. The prior slide 2020 talks about the issue that was just outlined about low-income housing tax credit properties reaching their expiration period and then being in a market area downtown that is being pushed by market forces. So this is just sort of a summary of units, and then units that will reach their expiration period. Not to say that they, absolutely have to expire. And maybe housing staff could talk a little bit about what potential options are for preserving some of these units.
Well, the major one is financing. We have subordinate loans on a lot of these projects, and we have. We're going to be pretty hard on not releasing that debt, rather working to roll over these units into another 15-year period and allowing that debt to remain on the properties. That's the biggest lever we have. Like I said, if there's property tax abatement that we can offer them for another 15 years, that'll certainly be on the table as well. But we'd like to see about 100, is the number that comes to mind, 100 new affordable housing units in the greater downtown area plan area, and just work towards implementing that goal. Preservation is again, a very key thing that we have to do. It's not easy because a lot of these developers, they are really looking at that date when they can get out of rent restrictions and either market their units to sell the whole properties, or of course raise the rents to market rents. So that's their payoff date.
Okay.
So we'll jump back up to the last slide in the which relates to talking about declining revenue sources, sort of other options for revenue. And so I don't know if, Jennifer, you want to talk through the Housing Trust Fund options.
So there's a variety of funding sources that are out there for housing trust funds across the country. And this slide kind of talks about what types of fees or taxes that cities are using around the country. This is something that could help fill that gap that the state tax credit being eliminated will certainly put us in a position where we cannot have a lot of those low-income housing units coming online because there's this big gap to fill. And some of these cities around the country have tried to use a housing trust fund as a way of filling that gap. And as you can see, a lot of it has to do with either property taxes or recording fees, some type of inclusionary zoning in lieu of, where they put those funds into a housing trust fund.
Okay, so moving ahead to Strategy B, which discusses encouraging creation and retention of housing units, all levels of affordability, emphasizing mixed income housing. And the first couple of slides here deal with choice, which I believe that our City Planning and Development Department is going to talk about.
Yes, good morning. Jeff Williams, City Planning and Development. So we in Kansas City have had our Choice project funded back in September of 2015, $30 million to look at neighborhoods on both sides of the Independence Avenue corridor, but really also the prime goal was for the replacement of the Shoto Courts apartment complex. So with a partnership of the city and with the Housing Authority and Brinshaw Development, we have made good progress. The first of buildings, a rehab of an existing building, Pendleton Flats, that opened up late last year, 30 mixed income units. And we were talking before about the whole concept of generating housing. Are we doing it in a way that's allowing for the continuation of affordable housing supply, but also allowing for opportunity for market forces to be able to stabilize and grow the community. And Pendleton Flats does that. 30 units, a really great rehab of a 1970s building. It's been a big game changer. There will be 3 projects that will be getting underway this year within the Choice area. 2 of them were mentioned earlier, the Pendleton Arts Block, that is just next to Independence Park. There'll be new units there with a theme on housing and studio space. And then Quinlan Row and Quinlan Place off the Paseo near 9th Street. So all 3 of those projects, again, with mixes of incomes happening within there. A little later this morning, we'll be talking about the CCI funds, critical community infrastructure dollars and funds that come with Choice, about $4 million, and how they could get deployed across this entire area. So some of those dollars will go to things we talked about earlier about home rehab, so new housing, additional rehab dollars for existing property owners to rehab their units. But it's also conversation and some of those dollars about making improvements to infrastructure as well, so improvements in Independence Park, improvements along Independence Avenue. We've had conversations recently with stakeholders in the community, KCU, school district, housing authority, us, about what can happen within this area to not only look at housing improvement, but also look at providing additional services to the community and greater quality of life enhancement. So it's a microcosm. Clearly, $30 million pots don't come very often, and there's a lot of additional neighborhoods that could use this level of attention, certainly. But I think this is one of the models, again, to take a look at creating new affordable housing, having some housing with some rental subsidy, and then letting the market be able to come into the community and for things to build.
How do we square across the board in terms of the quantity of affordable workforce, low-income housing that we have relative to other cities of our peer group? Are we in the same mess, better off, worse off, need more, doing okay? Any analysis at all?
No specific analysis. I think as we're looking at housing, we're looking across a number of different fronts. I think one of the things that we're looking to do is, just begin to define what is affordability. That's one of the council's business plan. What do we mean when we say that? You'll see some slides a little later on where we took some stabs at understanding what affordability is, either through minimum wage. So that's a little bit harder to say. I think the challenge is, again, community to community, looking at just different geographies and just some of the different market forces that we have. I mean, one of the things that we have here in Kansas City is a higher rate of single-family properties and ownerships, and that comes with some different potentials, but also some challenges in terms of providing affordable housing. So that's one of the challenges. Clearly, I think as we look at our new policy plan, data is what we need to dive into. So you saw some slides earlier with Peer Cities about how they are funding affordable housing. I'd want to do more research to see how we measure to other peer communities, but clearly that's part of even our outline for the new housing policy, was understanding how do we relate to other similar cities of our size, what we would consider our peers.
Okay.
So that we definitely need to do.
So the next screen seems frozen.
I think we were just leading right up to that.
Yeah, there's the next couple of strategies. I was waiting for you guys to get there. The next couple strategies deal with some of those underlying analysis questions. The first one is about supply and demand, and the next one is actually about defining workforce housing. And so under strategy C, and I would say, based on also the earlier conversation that John Wood outlined about the direction of this housing policy, it anticipates a lot more, not only analysis, but synthesis of existing data and analysis to really have a much better comprehensive understanding of housing. So what you see today under strategy C is a couple of small insights, I would say, but not a full picture. So the first one is a look at pulling in some research on extremely low-income individuals. Jeff, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think the idea was understanding and a little bit about market force and the idea of naturally occurring affordable units. So those are units that are non-subsidized but that are affordable for lower and moderate income households. Then taking a look at different geographies, and Jackson County really was a focus because the higher number of those naturally occurring units. So you're seeing the ratio on the screen, about 23 of those units per 1,000 housing units. That's housing that's affordable to extremely low-income individuals, so less than 30% of AMI. When you look at subsidized housing, in addition to naturally occurring, we're saying about half of the units that would be available in the Jackson County portion of KCMO would be affordable to extremely low-income individuals. Now, that's not taking into account condition of units, other types of things, neighborhood characteristics, other types of pieces, but that's just one way to take a look at the availability of the supply. But again, the idea, what is the quality of the unit, what measures, what efforts are necessary to provide that, especially in the subsidized perspective. So I think those are the beginnings of how we start to take a look at affordability and supply of housing. But again, there's a whole series of characteristics I think you'll see in some slides forthcoming that talk about not only the affordability of a rent of unit, but what other characteristics, access to transportation, et cetera, access to schools, that play into really the viability of the unit.
When you guys do your task force on housing, are you going to look at the transportation issues surrounding it? Because at the end of the day, you know, you can't do equity without transportation. I mean, it's,
Right.
you know, transportation is almost as important as housing.
Right. Yeah, the thinking is that we would actually have a series of meetings throughout the city, and we would have some guidelines, some parameters in which we can discuss a number of things that impact housing, transportation being one, issues of homelessness, workforce housing. Those are some of the gentrification. Those are the things that tend to seem to be resonating with people from different walks of life. And so we intend to throw them out there, put them on the table, and to talk about them and see what kind of feedback we can get from the public on directions and sentiment in terms of how we might be able to then to develop policy to guide us in some direction to address those issues.
Okay.
Kate, would it be possible actually to skip to slide 33, because that shows additional factors of affordability? So all the types of things that we're talking about, we just are talking about rent, but clearly it's all these other things that play into cost to maintain a home. So clearly the cost of utilities, heat, water, other types of things, obviously maintenance, property tax, insurance, transportation cost and travel times for households, just because the unit is there. If you're not able to get to your job to be able to make money to pay your rent, that's maybe not a viable unit for you. Quality, we talked about, threat of eviction, it'll take you back to the slide we were just on, and then larger quality of life in neighborhood. So it's all these additional factors that need to be addressed in some way as we look at the overall housing policy.
Okay.
So another factor, as Jeff just mentioned, is to consider in supply and demand and in affordability is evictions. And the mayor and council just received a pretty extensive business session presentation on this in December, I believe, November or December. So somewhat familiar with the issue, and it's certainly an ongoing conversation, and I think a good example of a conversation that is spanning sectors a little bit, certainly into the nonprofit sector. So this is just a quick snapshot of really a 30,000-foot view of evictions per year, just for the Jackson County portion of Kansas City, Missouri, and just the formal eviction process over this time period from 1999 to 2016 has averaged 5,367 formal evictions annually, which is equivalent to 14 evictions per calendar day. And it means that 4% of Jackson County households are impacted by eviction every year. I think when you think about eviction being focused on lower income individuals and also only renters, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that's really, of that low income renter population, eviction could be impacting 15 to 20% of households a year. So it's certainly, I think, an area that we're just starting to graze the surface of, and we have some really great resources in the form of the data set and some insight from a researcher who's worked on these issues. So I think hopefully, 6 months from now, we can say that we've really divined a lot more information about this area and also come up with some clear policy ideas, because I also think it's an area where there's already some policy recommendations on the table, and there'll probably be some robust discussion about it. But it's a complicating factor or in this entire discussion about housing. A few other pieces of data just wanted to share in the context of talking about supply and demand is actually resident perception about supply and demand. So, I mean, it's really important, as I just said, to actually get at a objective understanding of what our number of units looks like for different income groups, but also important to know how our residents feel about the availability of affordable housing. We added questions to the resident survey this year, so we only have half a year of data. Overall, I mean, I don't actually have any benchmarks available for this. We'll see at the end of the year if our contractor is able to provide them, if anyone else is asking questions like this. Overall, 50% of our residents are satisfied with availability of affordable housing and 18% are dissatisfied, which is it's at least not as bad as satisfaction with some other sort of service areas in the city. And it may compare favorably to other metros just because we do have a large supply of kind of regular, naturally affordable housing, as we talked about. However, those numbers look a lot different as you start breaking them up by different demographic groups. So most notably, when you look at satisfaction with availability of affordable housing by income, there's a substantial difference between the lowest income group, less than $30,000 a year, per household, and the highest income. So 29% of residents with less than $30,000 household income are dissatisfied with availability of affordable housing, and just about 39% satisfied. So clearly that the gap that is present that Jeff talked about for very low income households and individuals, you see that in resident perception here. A couple other ways in which you see this issue differentially impacting groups in the city. Satisfaction with availability of affordable housing by council district. You see the 3rd and the 5th district sort of being disproportionately dissatisfied with availability of affordable housing. Although I would note that every council district does have, between 10 and at least 10% of residents dissatisfied. So there are residents in every council district that are challenged by the issue of affordable housing. And finally, satisfaction with availability of affordable housing by race. You also see a notable difference here. 27% of African American residents are dissatisfied with availability of affordable housing compared to other racial groups. So again, this is sort of a tip of the iceberg, a first look at this data, something that I think we can combine with a lot of other data sets to understand, and then also hopefully track over time and see where movement is either positive or negative to give us a sense of our direction. Strategy D is kind of a subset of looking at supply and demand. It's about honing in on the issue of workforce housing units specifically. And so there's just 3 slides here that I'll let Jeff talk about, sort of first a general definition of workforce and then kind of a quick little case studies about what does workforce mean in Kansas City.
Right. So again, what's the challenge? People use the phrase affordable and workforce, and what do we actually mean? So we started with taking a look at and working, obviously, neighborhood housing services. When we say workforce housing, what do we mean? So for the purpose of this study, we're looking at housing that's affordable at 60% to 100% of the area median income. And you can see the ranges on the screen there. So 44.8 to 74.8 for a 4-person household. Then taking a look at the affordability based upon area median income, and then looking at them across the different categories for the market value analysis. So A to I, and A being where the highest median cost, median house price, and then working your way down the scale. So you're seeing there just the number of block groups in each of those categories and the percentage of affordability at 50% and then at 100%. So really the idea about where are affordable units located from a workforce housing perspective. And then the next thing we did was let's try some other ways of looking at household income. And the first thing was just taking a look at $15 an hour wage, a conversation we've had here about what should a minimum wage be. And then you're starting to see what some of the statistics are there. So $31,200 per year annual earnings for somebody full-time employment at that rate. Where does that put them in terms of the area median income? 52.7%. So just a little bit below that workforce block we identified. And then taking a look again, looking at those statistics, looking at areas of affordability. So if you're affordable at 50%, somebody's at 52.7%, this is giving you the sense of those different MVA categories where there would be some availability of housing. Then taking a look at that income and looking in two different ways. I'm sorry, actually go back one second, Kate, I'm sorry. Just to break down the idea about what somebody with that wage level, what could they look towards in terms of the ability to be able to purchase a home? And the standard was taking your yearly income times 3, so 93.6 would be the home price available to you. And then what does it translate down to rent? Quarter of your gross income for rent is about $650 a month. So then we upped it a little bit, and then we go to the next slide, and then looked at the living wage. What are we talking about? That's more $24.50 an hour. And then you can see how, with obviously the additional household income, how the percentage of area median income has gone up, the value of a home which would be affordable to you to purchase, and what your rent levels are. And again, just distribution across the city as it relates to the availability of those types of units from a purchase perspective. So I think this is the beginning of those types of studies to take a look at when we're talking about workforce, what do we mean? What do we see as being some minimum from a wage perspective to be able to have appropriate housing for yourself? And again, clearly we're talking about the blocks of folks from 60 to 100%. And that's, again, a lot of this is just really beginning to break down wage categories to really be able to understand what options there are and what interventions we would need. So again, in certain communities, the market is providing options, in others, limited options, and in some, none at all. And I think it's important to know where those areas are located. I think with the idea that we are able to look at having a wide range of housing affordability across the entirety of the city, being a bit more strategic about placing the affordable units in locations where there's access to multimodal transportation, walkable goods and services, other types of things that really help reduce the overall housing maintenance cost.
Okay.
So moving forward to Objective 3, which is to improve the conditions and livability of housing throughout the city. And Strategy A is to expand the reach of Project Lead Safe KC through increased awareness, communication, and testing. And so we'll turn it over to the Health Department to talk about that.
Good morning, Nasser Johari, Environmental Health Department. Today I'll try to present and I'll try to be brief about our Lead Safe KC program and what efforts we're doing in Kansas City, trying to expand to outreach our citizens out there and increase the awareness of the citizens for the services that we provide at the Health Department through our Lead Safe KC. Last year, quick comparison between the results of what we've been finding out there. 2017, we managed to find 39 cases, and these are cases of children under 6 that have higher than 15 microgram per deciliter as a result of lead in their blood. The acceptable number is 0. So this is when you're talking about 39 cases in comparison to 18. We are doing our best in being out there in the community. Next slide will show the number of lead testing that we completed for the year 2017. This is in comparison to almost 1,300 testing that we did in 2016. This is a result also of 50 outreaches, community outreach. We send our staff in the community to complete these outreaches and to do all these testing in the community, in comparison to only 30 that we completed in 2016. You can tell that less than 5% of the testing that we're doing at the office in our building, and the rest are out there in the community through our nursing staff. Also on the graph next to it, you can see that we have a spike usually, and this is normal, that we have a spike usually during back to school time. A lot of these also testing either done at the office, or most of them are out in the field at schools.
Amy Roberts, Kansas City, Missouri Health Department. I'm going to talk a little bit about our HUD grant, the application, and what we're seeing in the city and what our plans are. You can see from this slide that we have a lot of children under 6 in Kansas City as a whole, and also in 9 target zip codes. And the children under 6 are the kids that are at highest risk because they're the ones that have the most hand-to-mouth behavior, and typically kids are exposed by ingestion. So they get dust on their hands and then swallow it through their regular activities. So we have a lot of little ones in Kansas City, and then in our 9 target zip codes, we have a lot of little kids, and then we also have a lot of older housing. These 9 target zip codes are our highest risk in terms of number of kids, and then also percent housing that was built before 1978. So that's why, even though the Kansas City city limits is our overall target area, we also tend to focus and receive a lot of applications from these 9 top target zip codes, and a number of them are also in the lowest life expectancy areas as well. We do a lot of testing in our targeted zip codes, but again, we test throughout the city as well. And we do a lot of marketing for the Lead Safe KC program in our target zip codes. Number of homes remediated for lead. When we look at what we've done in all the years that we've had a lead hazard control grant, you know, to me, it's really exciting since I've been involved. But then when we look at the work that's ahead of us, it's daunting because we have a lot of old homes, and you know, we have a limited amount of funding that we get through our Lead Safe KC grant. And the total of houses that we've addressed is really less than 2% of the homes that are at risk. When we look at our Lead Safe KC grant, just for you all, $19 million seems like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. But in those grants, sometimes people say, well, how much of that money goes directly to home repair? And HUD requires us to put at least 65% of that HUD funding to direct costs for home repair. Looking at the next slide, our new grant, we got about $2.9 million, which is the maximum amount that you can get in that award. The grant will run for 36 months or 3 years. And we have currently a pool of 9 contractors. We are always accepting more contractors, so we would like to see as many contractors in the pool as we can. And we recruit contractors throughout the life of the grant. They have to be lead abatement contractors that are licensed, and they have to have experience and skill with the type of work that we do, which is primarily painting, window replacement, and some minor home repair in terms of, for example, handrails, steps, minor plumbing and electrical, appliance installs, plumbing, water leaks, and some asthma interventions. Currently, we're working on the environmental...
Mayor, I'm sorry, but before you go on, I just want to point out that I'm giving you props on this one, so no real questions, just the fact that this is a highly competitive grant that we have been very fortunate to get every opportunity, but there are cities out there that don't. And I would just point out that but for this, we would be even in worse shape than we already are with that housing stock and just the whole lead issue.
Right.
So just wanted to say thanks and keep it up.
And just ditto on that, we got the highest score also on this last round.
Good.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. And just for some context, we do around, with our HUD grant, we do around 70 to 75 units per year, so 70 to 75 homes. If we did not have our HUD grant, we might be able to do 3 homes a year, so to repair lead hazards. And we're getting rolling on our new grant. We're accepting applications and working on the environmental review, and then we'll move forward with home repair.
Some of the challenges that we have, other than funding with our lead program, is advertisement, is public awareness. Last year, we've been extremely active in trying to get more applications, more public awareness to let our citizens know that we actually exist and we are willing to do that lead abatement at their properties. Last year, as an example, we sent 170,000 inserts with the water bill. That resulted in 9 additional applications. 9 in comparison to 170,000 inserts, it sounds not that much, but in comparison to 72 properties that we work on annually, it's actually a lot. We also did 250 total number of ads on Channel 41 and Channel 9. We created 2 videos that we managed to play during prime time, during the Chiefs games, during the Voice. That resulted in total viewership of almost 11 million viewership. As a result of that, we generated 150 calls and 28 applications. Again, 128 applications. It's considered a lot of applications to the number of units that we usually work on annually.
Cool.
And
Thanks.
I'm trying to play the. We're trying to play the video here. Go on a commercial break. Do you want me to play the sound? You do the music.
Time's not available. Seem to notice that QuickTime's not available. This may not. On this computer.
Nasser, while he's trying to get that loaded up, why don't you go ahead and talk about some other issues?
Well, actually, on TV, we managed to get it to play. So these are 2 videos that we created. One of them was more like a scary movie type teaser for the public to give them a clear idea of the effect of lead on their health and their kids. The other one was more like the happy ending type, where we will show them that we are available for help if they wanted to apply, and we put all our contact information. One of the other things that we actually, we were very happy to announce that we completed the construction of our mobile clinic. As I mentioned previously, that less than 5% of our testing, it's done at the office. The rest, usually it's through community outreach. This mobile unit actually will help us out in promoting and protecting cost saving. It's going to help us to be out there in the community doing all these testing events. Not only for Lead Safe KC, it actually will help us out in our many other programs throughout the department, HIV, communicable disease, and many others. In addition to that, this unit can be used as an emergency response, can be used educational events, and also marketing for the health department. Actually, we managed to reserve a slot at the city market over the weekends. This coming summer, we will be at the city market with the unit parked up front, providing services.
The next strategy in the improved conditions is about implementing a healthy homes inspection program to protect rental property occupants from environmental hazards. And again, we'll turn it over to Health to talk about this.
Late last year, actually, we managed to put together a proposal for our Healthy Homes Inspection Program. Just a quick overview of 2017 numbers. Last year, we received a total of 351 healthy homes complaints. These are citizens that are complaining about health issues, healthy concerns, environmental related on their houses and their rented properties and their houses that they live in. We were able to respond only to 5 of those because they were extreme cases. That's 1% of the total phone calls that we received through our office. I'm sorry, the map to the right, it shows actually the areas per council district. It shows where are these phone calls coming from, and you can tell that they are in the inner side of city where we have that older housing stock of properties.
But there are calls from every district.
Throughout the city. Actually, some of the calls we've been receiving on newer housing in the city, newer rental properties and so on. Quick update on the where we at with our ordinance. As you may know, we did submit to committee. The ordinance was held in committee for further discussion. We will be actually scheduling another meeting with the Housing Committee to further discuss our proposal that we may be able to adopt, or maybe we may be able to put on ballot for this year. Just a quick reminder of what was our proposal for our Healthy Homes Ordinance. Basically, we decided to go with a complaint-based, and this is there will be no fee associated with that except the $25 annual application fee, and this is strictly complaint. We will respond as we receive complaints. There will be additional fees assigned for revisits. If we have to go back and re-inspect any of these rental properties due to non-compliance, we will be charging additional fee to cover our cost. And again, as I mentioned, we will be back to committee within the next month or so to present and to answer further questions.
How does a landlord submit a self-inspection? Don't they do that anyhow when they open up the doors and say, come rent the place? I mean, what's going to change there?
Well, on the second part of the question, don't they do that? I cannot answer that. But many jurisdictions, what they do, we provide them with what we will be looking for. What do you need to make sure that it's in place? And you, Mayor, you'll be surprised with some of those that we truly want you to have a kitchen sink in your rental properties before you rent it. And we were questioned when we mentioned that to landlords. They were surprised, like, do you want me to put a sink in there? Kitchen sink. I did the same.
Well,
we
and
have
some of them also forget to check to make sure there's a working smoke detector, or there's some basic safety things that this way they have a one-page high priority checklist that they can go down, document, send in. If we then get a complaint from that location, we've got a way to say, well, how come you sent this in, and all of that. But it's a way to encourage folks to do what they should be doing anyway.
I was being facetious when I said that, but thank you for taking me seriously. Something my wife and daughter and chief of staff seldom do. But I was just wondering whether or not self-inspections would be of any real value. I guess that depends to some extent on the volume and types of complaints that you may or may not get. Do you get, I'm assuming that there's complaints that roll in now.
Yes.
Okay. And you have no real authority to do much about it.
No, we don't. No, we don't. Actually, the other thing for the other reason for the self-inspection is the tenant awareness. So we want to make sure that the tenant, part of the that form, is to make sure that you get your tenant signature on that piece of inspection.
Okay. So the tenant have to sign off.
Yeah, so they are aware that there is a health department to protect them.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, because right now, basically, we can take the property away from being rented, but when we've got a shortage of housing, that's not the best option if there are ways to encourage folks to be fixing these as they go instead of letting them kind of fall into such bad repair that they can no longer rent them.
Okay, gotcha.
And before we leave this topic, I just wanted to briefly cover what we do have in the way of regulation of rental properties right now, which is a rental housing registration program. Does not involve any sort of inspection or complaint response, but it's just a way of trying to understand our volume of rental housing and be able to respond accordingly. So, and wanted to highlight this for two reasons. One, because it's relevant in light of the discussion about additional policies. But the other is that this is actually the time period for annual registration, free registration for property owners. They are required to register or update the register, basically verify the registration on their rental property once a year in the months of December and January. And so PSA for rental property owners that can be done online on a property basis. And just some sort of statistics about how this program, I think, is functioning to date. So far, we've had about 5,000 properties register. That's as of, a couple weeks ago. And from talking to Neighborhood and Housing Services, that number is expected to climb in January. There's a lot of property owners that do respond in the late half of the month, but still doesn't really come anywhere close to approximately the number of parcels of residential rental housing are around 70,000, 71,000. So even if this climbs up to, the 20 to 30,000, which I think is about what it was last year, less than half of all rental housing represented through this registration process. And that's despite the fact that about 3,300 violations were issued last year for failure to register. So I think it speaks to the limitations of the existing policy in terms of encouraging, landlords to actually take steps toward, keeping the city in the loop about their properties.
Yeah, we have a staff person, Pearline McFall, has been working on this for this past year, and I know she'll be around at least for, I think, another year on working on this. So we do encouraging landlords to register. If there's an issue of whether the property is rental or not, there is a process for them to complain, and there's a process that we would work with them with a law department to address that. But Pearline McFall is a person that the landlords need to be in contact with.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Next strategy in here is to identify funding sources to improve and maximize energy efficiency in order to reduce costs for residents, particularly on low-income households and multifamily low-income housing. And so the main liaison to this strategy is Office of Environmental Quality. So we'll turn it over to Dennis.
Dennis Murphy, Chief Environmental Officer. And I'm going to start off by referring back to a remark that Jeff made earlier about some of the additional factors to consider in affordability. And I think two of them that he mentioned are directly relevant to the issue of energy efficiency. One is the cost of utilities, obviously, but another one that often isn't recognized is quality of the affordable unit. So energy efficiency not only can reduce utility bills, but it can also increase the comfort of a home during cold weather and hot weather, and I think that's particularly timely with what we're going through right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the clean energy resolution that was adopted by the Mayor and City Council back in August of this year. It addresses the feasibility of, or the evaluation regarding the feasibility of 10 major clean energy initiatives, and two of those are particularly relevant to the conversation we're having today. Item D talks about developing an initiative to increase energy and water efficiency, solar and electric vehicles in underserved communities. And the second one is E, which is developing a strategy to increase customer interest in clean energy financing, including property-assessed clean energy investments, which is so-called PACE loans, and looking at those particularly at the time of financing with an emphasis on low-income multifamily building owners. And I think that's relevant, particularly in the context of the conversation we were having earlier about at the end of a 15-year tax abatement period may prove, and one of the conversations that we're involved in right now is having a discussion with building owners of low-income multifamily housing and approaching them in, say, year 14 before they come up for the end of their tax abatement period and looking at PACE being potentially one piece of gap financing that would help them achieve the necessary financing going forward in a way that would also increase the energy efficiency of the housing units going forward. And the other element that's important to that relates back to something that Stuart was talking about, which is roof repair. And PACE loans can actually pay for roof repairs as well as for energy efficiency improvements, because it's widely recognized that it doesn't make sense to try to improve the energy efficiency of a building if it has a leaking roof. So I'm going to talk briefly now not just about low-income housing, but again, this issue of funding sources to improve energy efficiency cuts across all housing types. And one of the things that I wanted to note was that last year the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions and the U.S. Conference of Mayors collaborated to form something called the Alliance for a Sustainable Future. And they published a book called American Mayors and Businesses Building Partnerships for a Low-Carbon Future. And I'm pleased to say that Kansas City and Mayor James were featured in that in a case study talking about the Residential Hero or Residential PACE program. And you see here on this slide some of the results of the first year of operation. The city is affiliated with two different PACE providers. Mayor Pro Tem Wagner has been a strong advocate for PACE financing here in Kansas City. As a part of the Missouri Clean Energy District, they have contracted with Renovate America for a residential PACE program that was launched in September of 2017 or 2016. And in the first year of operation, they performed over 1,000 residential energy assessments, and they actually funded 538 home improvement projects. 460 of those were energy efficiency programs, and 78 of them were actually solar energy installations, because PACE can be used either for energy efficiency or renewable energy. So Kansas City is fortunate that we've become a regional leader and even a national leader in terms of promoting PACE financing, both for residential building owners in our community as well as commercial building owners. And I'm pleased to say that we've seen remarkable implementation of PACE programs, again, in all 6 council districts. So it hasn't been just localized in one area of the city. It really has been citywide. So we look forward to a second year.
I don't want anybody to be confused by the introduction of Hero program, my name being associated with that, around the same time that the Black Panther TV show is going to start. I mean,
I can safely say, Mr. Mayor, that thought never crossed my mind. So I think you're in good shape.
Well, I wasn't just talking to you.
Well, you were looking at me.
Now, with that said, PACE loans are an important part of the overall mix for how we're dealing with promoting energy efficiency in housing, but it's not a method that's likely to benefit low-income households because they're not in a position to take on additional debt. So we have been looking at a variety.
That's going to be even more true with the lack of credits.
Yes, with the lack of housing, low-income housing tax credits, it's become an even more critical issue. And that's why, again, we're looking at whether PACE loans might be a tool that some owners of low-income multifamily housing might be interested in using as a part of the gap financing as they refinance their projects at the end of the tax abatement period. However, we have been involved in conversation with a number of groups that are both national, regional, and statewide over the past year that have been very interested in this area of how to strategically provide the benefits of energy efficiency housing to lower-income residents, both in single-family and multifamily buildings across the entire state of Missouri. So there's a group called Efficiency for All that is an initiative focused on improving energy efficiency of low-income homes. The Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, it's based out of Chicago, has also been operating in this landscape for quite some time. The National Housing Trust, the Natural Resources Defense Council, the PACE providers, but also important participants in this conversation have been our local utilities. So both Kansas City Power and Light, our investor-owned electrical utility, and Spire Energy, which is our local natural gas utility, are involved in those conversations, along with some nonprofit groups, including the Metropolitan Energy Center, Bridging the Gap, and a statewide group called Renew Missouri. So we have tried to focus some of those conversations recently, particularly on the situation in Kansas City, because we think we have an opportunity to be a pilot for some activities that may eventually spread across the entire state of Missouri, and that's our hope as we go forward. And as a result of these conversations, the next slide will point out that in that little box you can see that we're currently exploring the possibility of a half-day listening session that we hope to have next month on February 20th, where we will invite representatives of neighborhoods to come in and talk to us about some of the ideas that we're discussing on how we think we might be able to make energy efficiency more accessible and more affordable for low-income households. But we don't want to just assume that we have the answer. So we plan to have a listening session at the Kauffman Foundation, bring in representatives of many neighborhoods, prime the pump with them and talk about some of the ideas that we've got, but do more listening than talking, where we ask them what kind of programs, what kind of initiatives do they think would be well received in their neighborhoods and might be more effective. So there are a number of other things that continue on. The low-income weatherization program that's funded by utilities has been in operation for many years. That continues to be operated by community services. We talked about the lead-safe KC work that also addresses, in some cases, weatherization benefits, and then the minor home repair program, which also dovetails. And one of the things that we really need to do is to try to make sure that we do as good a job of meshing minor home repair with home weatherization as we can, because you can't weatherize a home that has a leaking roof or other minor home repair needs that may not be fundable, because the weatherization program cannot do minor home repairs. So we're looking at ways to try to leverage resources, create new partnerships in ways that we can hopefully, again, reduce utility bills and increase the comfort of low-income homes in Kansas City.
Okay,
and I think essentially this next slide is what Dennis was just talking about. The United Community Services actually has a Healthy Home Services program. But again, some of the issues they're facing is you can't have a Healthy Homes program dealing with asthma and those types of things, and you can't do weatherization if you don't have minor home repairs. So I think it's important that going forth we need to be aligning Dennis's efforts with our neighborhood and housing services efforts with health department's efforts, and because we just need to be a little bit more coordinated and a little bit more productive in that regard.
Okay, the last strategy in the improved condition of housing objective is to utilize the city's transit-oriented development policy to encourage higher density for new housing developments within close proximity of frequent public transit service. So city planning is going to cover this issue.
Yes, and from a TOD perspective, we adopted a policy back in May of last year that talked about what can we do to focus land uses around transit, maximize access to frequent high service, high quality transit, and then understanding with the access and increasing and focusing land uses around that transit, what can we do from a housing perspective. So TOD, it's connected, it's dense, it's diverse in terms of use, and I think for the purpose of today's conversation, diverse even in terms of price point affordability, and it's designed. It's being a bit strategic and really focusing in around the transit node to make sure that we are getting the best bang for our buck for that transit investment that we make. But essentially, it's really looking at a more compact development pattern. It's concentrations, again, of uses and services, and then increasing the number of users that help make the provision of the transit service viable, but really create these robust environments where people are minimizing their housing costs because there's closer proximity between work and home and school, and there are a variety of methods to go between those multiple places. So this is a map that's just looking at household density, and what the lines that you see highlighted are the Main Street max, the Troost max, and right now it's the 71 Prospect, but the forthcoming Prospect max. And then looking at some of those households per acre, and you're looking at some of the densities. Clearly, we want to be in those darker zones. So more than 10 households per acre. And when we're talking about really an acre, we're talking about an area that's about 200 feet by 200 feet. So depending on your development pattern with that kind of a footprint, you could clearly have a higher density multifamily apartment building, put a lot more people than 10 households on that acre. So I think that when we look at TOD and its implementation, it really is encouraging private sector to make investments from a housing perspective at higher densities along these lines to make sure that people have access to transit, and then also with the concentration of higher population, then at that point it's the ability to provide greater goods and services to the community. So again, the goal is to boost some of those densities, and how we're going about doing that, encouraging it, is taking a look at a variety of different techniques. We had our first conversation at PZ&ED last week as it relates to Main Street overlay. This is the transition of the special review district into a zoning overlay. So it has the power of law, if you will, the force of zoning to take a look at a variety of different pieces, where buildings are placed, what they're made out of, their features, how transparent, what's the quality of walking past the building along the sidewalk. Parking and understanding the place of parking, and on this corridor that the focus should be on other modes of transportation before we get to vehicle, and then other quality of life signage. But ultimately, it's looking at those increased densities. You're seeing a rendering of a project that is proposed at 3260 Main Street, so that's just south of Linwood and Main. So higher density residential development along a high quality transit corridor. The overlay seeks to encourage this type of development. And then when you look at Prospect and Troost, again, same concept. I think you look at each corridor in terms of where they're at, and I think in Troost, you're seeing the improvement in the level of development that's happening along Troost, and greater densities are being created there as well. So multifamily buildings are happening near different stops. Prospect, I think we have the opportunity to be ahead of the curve. It's looking at some type of either a zoning overlay, other guidance that focuses development around station areas. And part of the TOD overlay is also talking about, or ordinance I should say, is also talking about creating station area plans. So really looking specifically at a particular node, and the slide in the screen is looking at 39th in Prospect and what can happen there. So leveraging all that's there, what other development can happen there. So because we have long corridors, being very strategic around station areas as being centers of activity. So as transit improvements happen, make sure that we have some good proactive planning tools, or then we just have flat out ordinance to encourage the type of development we want to see happen.
Okay, that takes us to the last objective of the housing goal, and that is to support rehab and construction of housing for the purpose of revitalizing neighborhoods in the city. And again, there are several strategies under this. The first one being perform targeted housing condition surveys to define or refine improvement activities. And so again, city planning development's going to talk a little bit about a pilot project in this area.
Right, and this is the area we're talking about is the heart of the city proactive TIF area. So we're talking about from 27th down to 47th, from a block off of Truth Harrison over to 71 Highway. And what we want to make sure we do is we look at any area where a large amount of funding is being focused on redevelopment, is making sure we have a good baseline about understanding conditions. So we're going to be using camera equipment mounted to vehicles that will allow us to do some street-level photography and give us a baseline of housing condition. And then we will do this in a variety of other areas over time as we look at infusing a lot of money into a particular area. It's a good baseline. It's a good way to kind of go back and assess. It's a good way for us as staff to be able to provide guidance to other departments as it relates to some of their interventions and some of the programs that they would undertake in the area. So don't be scared. There'll be a vehicle driving around, not unlike what Google does. But the idea, again, was really just making sure we have some really good baselines about existing condition before we put lots of money into an initiative.
What are the east-west streets again? I can't really tell. This is so small.
It's Harrison, so one block west of Troost, just to be able to make sure we capture the Troost corridor, and then we're over to 71 Highway.
Okay.
27th Street on the north, right?
27th on the north and 47th on the south, Cleveland Boulevard.
Thanks.
Next strategy is about supporting the establishment of a new local housing financing mechanism to offer single-family rehab and new infill construction to support home ownership opportunities, assigned to neighborhood and housing services.
So we have been focused primarily on the rehab portion of this. The biggest the biggest challenge we have is the gap between when you're rehabbing houses, the cost of rehabbing versus the value of the property from an appraisal standpoint. And so the little table here basically shows what that gap is, and just a typical example of a $43,000 project acquisition and rehab. And typically what a bank would finance is up to 80% loan to value, which means there's a gap of $19,000. So what we're looking at doing is proposing to come up with a subordinated mortgage piece that would leverage $10 million of bank financing from six banks we're working with right now. For the past year, we've been working on a term sheet with the banks to identify underwriting parameters as well as target areas that we would be targeting this program in. So basically that would feed off of the housing condition survey that Jeff just spoke of, and as well as some of the 5-year consolidated plan target areas where we would be targeting these programs in some of the, such as Ivanhoe or Key Coalition, et cetera. And so the goal is to probably by mid-year of 2018, starting this winter and spring, is to begin making this ask of the $10 million from the banks. We would leverage that with some financing from the city is proposing to offer in terms of subordinated mortgage as well as a loan loss reserve. So we're working on structuring that as we speak. We would also put out an RFP for a loan servicer originator, some entity that would actually be making these loans to the end user, because banks are not really in the business of doing rehab loans, particularly those loans where there's a gap in the financing. And so that's kind of where we are. And so the goal is to have this in 2018 and make it available for end users.
Are you close? I know 2018 just started literally, but are you going to get that done this year?
Yeah, we intend to. We've been at this for a year with the banks, and it's sort of an iterative process. They have a lot of comment about the underwriting, so we've finally got that done now, and now we are at the point of now asking for the money from the banks to compile the $10 million loan fund. So we expect to start those asks actually next month.
Okay.
And I should say we got a lot of pro bono assistance from Posinelli to help us put together this firm and kind of lead the term sheet conversation. So it's been a good public-private partnership to kind of come up with something that we think the banks will get Community Reinvestment Act credit for, and we'll be able to do a lot of targeted housing rehab,
right,
which is where that gap is. So
good. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
The last strategy in here is about integrating the results of the market value analysis into city housing and economic development strategies. You've already seen a little bit of reference to the market value analysis, which essentially helps to summarize the different residential housing markets in Kansas City based on a census block group level. So pretty small geography. It allows us to sort of visualize what's the relative strengths and weaknesses of the residential housing market. And the first slide is kind kind of a repeat, just reminding everyone what this shows, and also that all this data, the map that you can play around with, also the data you can download, is all available online on City Planning's website. But that the MVA gives us a lot of insight into not only median sales price, which is sort of how the different levels step down from the A to I, but also speaks to things like owner occupancy, permit activity, violations, so, sort of blight issues, percent vacant and percent distressed sales. So different components of that impact the market in addition to price. And so we've got a couple of case studies here. The first one, I think City Planning is going to speak to in terms of one way to use the MVA and looking at housing.
So the idea was looking at the MVA and looking at the data and understanding communities and understanding what interventions could the city have in terms of stabilization and neighborhood improvement, and then really understanding those different categories. In certain cases, depending on where you're at in the city, the quality community housing types are very similar. In other communities, it's vastly different. But we looked across the 9 different categories of market strength that the MVA identified, and we really, when we looked at the E and F categories, and you're seeing the median sale prices there, we found that E and F communities, almost regardless of their location within the city, had lots of similar characteristics. And that's helpful in terms of how we would look at working with those communities. So E and F, and you're seeing that we have large areas of E and F communities just north of the river and then in southern Kansas City. But we go to the next slide. We kind of talk about why we see them being similar in neighborhood form. They're primarily post-World War communities, suburban in nature. They often lack sidewalks, curbs, gutters. But we know that, or we feel that, looking at all those categories, interventions in one E and F market, something we do and something we work, we really believe has the potential to be replicated across all those other markets because of their similar factors and features. And so that's the idea, one way in which to use this data. So identifying those areas with the highest degree of similarity, piloting something, seeing what happens, knowing that it works, and then rolling it out across other markets. And I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, showing photos down there, northern part of Kansas City, South Kansas City, you could flip the labels and really not really be able to kind of tell the difference. And so that's what E and F category communities or blocks have going for them in terms of being able to replicate projects.
One final piece of analysis coming out of our office, and credit to Eric Roche, our Chief Data Officer, for undertaking this. So this is sort of a little bit of a wonky graph and a lot of detail, but I'll attempt to step you through it because I think it's an important insight for us as we think about different strategies, and also certainly the relationship between housing issues and blight. The question we're trying to ask here was, what's the relationship between owner occupancy in an area, so not for individual houses, but at a block group level? You can say that a block group has, 30% owner occupancy, 50%, 70%, kind of looking at that group. What's the relationship between that and the number of code violations? And I think a theory that's held out there is that owner occupancy is generally related to lower code violations. The idea that people are invested in their neighborhoods, thus there's less blight, there's less issues with long-term home maintenance.
And you got all of this from this graph?
So that was the question.
Where exactly is that question?
That's the first bullet, and the first and second bullet really. So what we basically did was just graph this. Each block group is one dot, and each graph shows, and the reason there's so many of them, this is called small multiples. It's showing it for each of the MVA groups, A through I, and they're color coded for slight ease in a reading. And the axes are the same on all of them. Along the bottom, it's owner occupancy. For each of those, it's only shown at the very bottom. And then along the left-hand side is number of open violations. And so basically, if we had seen this relationship that with really low owner occupancy, high rates of code violations, high owner occupancy, low rates of code violations, you would see something close to a line from a line trending downward in all or many of these little graphs. You don't see that in any of them. If anything, so an insight. So what you do see, which is still interesting, there's lots of things to be derived. You do see a higher rate of code violations as it steps up from sort of the groupings. A and B fairly low, C and D stepping up a little, E and F a little higher, and then certainly G, H, and I have among the highest levels, which you would expect. Code violations are built into the MVA. It's part of the distinguishing factor. But a really interesting thing is you see a lot of variation in all of these groups. So even in G, H, and I, while you have some of the block groups with the highest rate of code violations, you also have relatively low code violations. And the factor there doesn't appear to be whether or not they have a lot of homeowners or not, because you have homeowner-dominated areas with high violations. You have renter-dominated with low violations. So so that's and actually, if we were to point out any possible trend, it actually suggestive that sometimes where you see the higher rates of code violations is right around the 50%. Owner occupancy, which one hypothesis could be that that's where you have actually the most conflict between renters and homeowners. The most, there's equal representation of both, and so maybe that's driving up at least complaints about code violations because you have homeowners who are trying to preserve something, and so that's a theory that's there. But so I think it suggests to us to first of all not think of owner occupancy as something that's going to solve blight by itself, and maybe a tool that in tandem with other things helps, but it doesn't suggest that if we can just get everybody to all these neighborhoods to be homeowner occupied, dominated, that's going to solve our revitalization issue. And I think it also does suggest that maybe there's some small insights here that we can, looking block group by block group, say what is going on in these areas that have lower levels of code violations but are in more distressed residential markets. Are there other factors there that are causing the distress? Is it just that people aren't reporting violations, and that's the issue, and we need to do a better job of capturing them? So that's, in a nutshell, what this is showing. I think
You know what this is called?
What?
A job security vision.
Exactly.
Because as long as you keep doing these things, you have to be here to explain it.
Yes. There's a reason it's the last slide in the presentation. That we go ahead and suck up everybody's remaining brain power before and end on that note.
It's the idea of primacy and recency. So you start it and you end, so we have to remember you now.
Yes, good.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate your work.
That does beg the policy question as we head into the housing policy conversations. Because for years, decades, our housing policy has been focused on home ownership.
Yeah.
Minor home repair, single-family new construction. This data would, and under the guiding theory that owner-occupied communities are inherently more stable, inherently have lower code violations, hence more stability than other higher. So this, we have to think about this as we move forward. Do we want to start to look at, I know we've been reticent to get into rental housing assistance because of the fact that, well, there's a landlord out there that we're implicitly subsidizing. But this kind of data suggests that maybe we ought to look at in a targeted location, especially in certain neighborhoods, maybe a housing assistance program for rentals with a quality landlord without a history of code violations might make an effective use of resources. So we ought to frame that as part of that. That would be a change from the overarching city policy, because we have essentially done rental housing assistance through the new construction.
Mm-hmm. There have been some who have suggested that.
Rehab.
Right. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you may have a lot of existing homeowner-occupied units where the homeowner is become elderly or they're on fixed income, and the cost of construction is is high compared to what's my other choice, pay utilities or go to the doctor and that kind of thing. So we find a lot of code violations in these owner-occupied housing, particularly larger in places like, for example, Santa Fe. You look at a place like Santa Fe, you got these large homes. You can drive around and see the roofs, the eaves, the soffits, the downspouts, et cetera, need repair. But some people may not have the resources to do it, and hope that someone doesn't call them in and for a violation. Otherwise, people are not going to self-report themselves.
Now, looking at a number of alternate forms of ownership here, and there's a tier between a single-family home and multifamily, looking at two-family homes, other homes where someone actually has a rental unit that could be affordably based that's actually helping offset a mortgage cost. The whole concept of cooperative ownership here and affordable cooperative ownership is another interesting model as well. So ways in which people can, with, at a reasonable rate, be able to build some equity themselves, be able to kind of move through kind of the housing chain, so to speak. So looking at a whole series of alternate ownership types really does make sense for us. And again, back to the concept of just allowing people to be able to age in place, because that will have massive amounts of savings for us in maybe different areas other than housing.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Kate. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Yeah.